In a luxurious mansion, a boy surrounded by wealth is given 5 perfect options to fill the emptiness in his life. But his heart points to someone no one expected. The Mitchell mansion gleamed under the afternoon sun of Westfield. Located in Maple Ridge Estates, one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the city, the property impressed anyone who passed by the tree-lined avenue. High walls, discreetly positioned security cameras, and an imposing wrought-iron gate kept the outside world at a distance. The meticulously maintained gardens, tended by a team of gardeners, displayed flowering dogwoods in full bloom, their vibrant colors contrasting with the modern minimalist architecture of the main house. Inside that private world, isolated from the rest of the city, Lucas Mitchell observed the movement of gardeners through his bedroom window. At 9 years old, the brown-haired boy with expressive eyes seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. Sitting on the windowsill, he hugged his knees against his chest while following the gardeners' comings and goings with his gaze. "Young Lucas, your father is calling you for lunch," announced Margaret, the housekeeper, knocking lightly on the half-open door. Lucas didn't respond immediately. He continued staring at the garden as if he might find something there that he had lost. "Is he busy on the phone as usual?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the window. "No, sir. Today he insisted on having lunch with you. He's waiting." In the dining room. The boy sighed, slowly descending from the windowsill. His steps dragged as he followed the wide corridor, decorated with expensive artwork and framed photographs of distant landscapes. No family photos, no visual record of his mother, Emily. It was as if the past had been carefully erased from the walls of that house. In the dining room, Edward Mitchell, a 45-year-old man with graying temples and impeccable posture, was checking messages on his cell phone while waiting. Upon noticing his son's presence, he put the device in the pocket of his navy blue blazer and sketched a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lucas, finally. Sit down. We have important matters to discuss." The dining table, long enough to accommodate 20 people, made father and son seem even more distant from each other. Lucas sat to his father's right, where Margaret had already placed his plate. Silence hung between them as the staff served the meal prepared by the private chef. "How was school today?" asked Edward, methodically cutting a piece of filet mignon. "Normal," replied Lucas, playing with his food without enthusiasm. Edward observed his son for a few moments, noticing the soft, dark circles beginning to form under the childish eyes. The boy had grown thinner and quieter since Emily's departure 2 years ago. Doctors had warned about signs of childhood depression, but Edward firmly believed that time would heal all wounds. "Lucas, I've made an important decision for both of us," he announced, wiping his lips with the linen napkin. "It's time for us to move forward, to rebuild our family." The boy raised his eyes from his plate, suddenly attentive. "I've invited some very special women to visit us next Saturday. They are people from our social circle, refined and successful. I want you to meet them." "Why?" asked Lucas, dropping his fork. "Because one of them could become my wife and your new mother. I thought you might help me choose." Lucas's expression hardened. His eyes, previously opaque with sadness, now sparked with indignation. "I don't want a new mother." Edward breathed deeply, controlling his frustration. "Son, I understand that you still miss your mother. We all do, but a house needs a feminine presence, someone to take care of us, to bring life back to this place. The house already has women. There's Margaret, Susan from the kitchen, and Patricia." The mention of that last name made Edward frown. "I'm talking about a wife, Lucas, a companion for me and a mother for you, not employees." The boy pushed away his plate, still full, and crossed his arms. The abrupt movement knocked over his juice glass, staining the immaculate tablecloth. "Sorry, sir," said Patricia, quickly emerging from the kitchen to clean up the spill. Lucas observed the woman of about 30, black hair tied in a simple bun, wearing the discreet uniform of the house staff. Unlike the other employees, Patricia always looked him in the eyes when they talked, always had time to listen to his stories, even the silliest ones. In the 6 months she had worked there, she had become the only person Lucas really felt comfortable with. "It's fine, Patricia," Edward replied dryly. Lucas was just leaving to do his homework. The boy stood up without protesting, but before Leaving the room, he cast a final glance at his father. "I won't choose anyone. I don't need another mother." As he passed Patricia, she smiled discreetly at him, an almost imperceptible gesture that nonetheless brought more comfort than any words could offer. That afternoon, while Edward conducted a video conference in his office, Lucas remained in the backyard, stacking colored pebbles he collected during his walks around the property. It was a ritual he had developed in recent months. Each stone represented a day since his mother had left, a silent way to keep her memory alive. Patricia approached, carrying a tray with milk and homemade cookies. "May I join you?" she asked, placing the tray on the wooden bench. Lucas nodded, moving to give her space. For a few minutes they sat in silence, watching the birds visiting the feeders scattered throughout the garden. "My father wants to bring women for me to meet on Saturday," he finally said, his small voice almost getting lost in the afternoon breeze. Patricia listened attentively without interrupting while Lucas explained Edward's plan. "And how do you feel about that?" she asked when the boy finished. "I don't want anyone. They'll pretend to like me, but they only want my father's money." The child's raw honesty made Patricia sigh. Unlike other adults, she never underestimated Lucas's perception. Sometimes adults make decisions thinking they're doing what's best, even when they don't ask what we really need, she said, carefully choosing her words. "Your father believes a new wife will bring happiness to both of you." "He's not even home to be happy," muttered Lucas. "He just works and travels." Patricia looked at the imposing mansion, reflecting on how that place, with all its luxury, seemed so empty of joy. She had been hired after answering a newspaper ad, desperately needing the job after losing her previous position as an elementary school teacher when the school where she worked closed. She never imagined she would find such a strong connection with the young Mitchell heir. "You know what we can do?" she suggested, trying to cheer the boy up. "Let's prepare a surprise for your father, something that shows that you two can be happy together without needing anyone else." Lucas's eyes lit up for the first time that day. "What kind of surprise?" "How about we make that chocolate cake you like so much? We can prepare it together, and afterward, you can show your father the new chess game you learned." Lucas's momentary enthusiasm quickly disappeared. "He won't have time. Then we'll make something so special that he'll make time," Patricia responded with determination. On the other side of the garden, through the office window, Edward observed the interaction between his son and the employee. Something about the familiarity between the two deeply bothered him. He checked his wristwatch. Only 3 days left until Saturday. 3 days to prepare Lucas to meet the carefully selected candidates with the help of his executive assistant. That night, when Patricia went to check if Lucas was sleeping, she found him sitting on the bed, hugging a photo album that he kept hidden under the mattress. They were images of Emily, smiling on beaches, holding baby Lucas, planting flowers in the garden. Memories of a time when the mansion was truly a home. "She used to sing to me every night," said Lucas, caressing a photo where his mother appeared at the piano. "Then she would tell stories until I fell asleep." Patricia sat on the edge of the bed, feeling her heart tighten. "I'm sure she was a wonderful mother. The best in the world," confirmed Lucas, closing the album and hiding it again. "No one can replace her." As Patricia arranged the covers and wished him good night, a certainty grew in her chest. That meeting organized by Edward was doomed to failure. None of the candidates, no matter how perfect they looked on paper, would be able to fill the void left by Emily in Lucas's heart. Saturday arrived with an exceptionally blue sky over Westfield. The Mitchell mansion had been meticulously prepared to receive the special guests. Arrangements of rare orchids, brought specially from the Westfield Botanical Garden, decorated the main room. The chef prepared elaborate canapes in the kitchen, while the staff polished crystal glasses and fluffed silk cushions on the sofas. Edward inspected every detail, adjusting the position of picture frames on the mantelpiece, all carefully, selected to show happy moments between father and son, excluding any image that might remind them of Emily. He wore a custom-made Italian suit, hair perfectly styled, the image of the successful businessman ready to interview candidates, not for a position in his company, but for an even more important role. "Lucas, are you ready?" he asked, knocking on his son's bedroom door. There was no answer. Edward entered, to find the boy sitting on the edge of the bed, still in his pajamas with his feet dangling without touching the floor. "Son, the guests will arrive in less than an hour. You need to get dressed. I put your new clothes on the chair." Lucas looked at the set of dress pants and shirt that seemed more appropriate for a miniature adult than for a child. "I don't want to meet these people." Edward breathed deeply, controlling his impatience. "It's not a question of what you want, Lucas. It's about what our family needs. Now get dressed and come downstairs in 15 minutes. Margaret will come to help you." Before the boy could protest again, Edward left, closing the door with more force than he intended. In the hallway, he encountered Patricia carrying clean towels. "Mr. Mitchell," she greeted with a discreet nod. "Patricia, remember what we discussed. During today's meeting, you and the other staff should remain at the back of the house. No interruptions unless called for." "Yes, sir. I understand perfectly." There was something in her tone that made Edward pause, a mixture of concern and disapproval that he preferred to ignore. "Good, and if you see Lucas trying to hide or run away from the room, inform me immediately." As the appointed time approached, anxiety grew among the mansion's residents. Lucas, finally dressed according to his father's expectations, sat on the last step of the staircase, watching the movement of the staff like someone witnessing preparations for an execution. The first car arrived exactly at 4 o'clock. A silver Mercedes parked in the circular driveway, and from it descended Christine Anderson, a renowned plastic surgeon of 38 years. Meticulously straightened blonde hair fell over the shoulders of her navy blue designer dress. Discreet jewelry completed the elegant and calculated look. "Edward, it's been so long," she exclaimed, offering her face for a formal kiss. "Christine, I'm glad you could come. Allow me to introduce my son, Lucas." The boy, who had been practically dragged to the entrance hall, mechanically extended his hand as he had been instructed. Christine bent down, leveling with him, a too-perfect smile revealing porcelain teeth. "What a handsome little boy. You have your father's eyes, did you know?" Lucas didn't answer. He knew he didn't have his father's eyes. He had his mother's greenish-brown, as everyone used to comment before. The second car arrived minutes later. From it emerged Helen Vaughan, 42, owner of a network of elite schools. Tall, imposing, with brown hair in an elaborate bun, she walked as if the world should adjust to her presence, not the other way around. "Edward, this place continues to be as magnificent as ever," she commented, handing her light cashmere coat to one of the staff as if she already considered herself the lady of the house. Her gaze evaluated Lucas from head to toe, as if analyzing the potential and flaws of a new student. "So this is young Lucas. Helen Vaughan, pleased to meet you. I'm sure we'll get along very well. I adore well-behaved, studious children." The slightly threatening tone didn't go unnoticed by Lucas, who took a step back, partially positioning himself behind his father. The next to arrive were Deborah Monroe, 35, a corporate lawyer from a traditional Chicago family, and Rebecca Parker, 39, a digital influencer specializing in luxury lifestyle, who couldn't resist taking a selfie with Edward right at the entrance, promising not to post it for now. The last guest was Fiona Taylor, 40, a businesswoman in the real estate industry, owner of a development company that rivaled Edward's ventures in some regions. Of all of them, she seemed the least interested in impressing, wearing a simple but elegant pants and blazer set and minimal makeup. With the 5 women gathered in the main room, Edward acted as the perfect host, serving champagne and guiding the conversation as he would conduct a business meeting. Lucas remained seated in a distant armchair, observing the adults' interaction with suspicion. "I thought of a garden tour before tea," announced Edward. "Lucas can show his favorite spot to each of you, individually. That way you'll have the opportunity to talk without the pressure of a group." The boy's eyes widened, horrified at the prospect. "Excellent idea," exclaimed Christine, being the first to volunteer. Reluctantly, Lucas guided the surgeon to the garden. They walked in awkward silence until they reached a small bench under her dogwood tree. "So do you like to draw, play video games? What are your hobbies?" she asked, trying to start a conversation. "I like to stack pebbles," replied Lucas, pointing to a small, colorful collection near the bench. Christine laughed as if he had told a joke. "How cute! But seriously, what do you really like to do?" "Sports, perhaps. I have a nephew your age who loves tennis." Lucas didn't answer, just bent down to pick up a yellowish pebble, adding it to the top of his pile. Christine observed, clearly uncomfortable with the silence, until their allotted time ended. The following interactions weren't much different. Helen tried to impress him with stories about the educational trips she organized for the students at her schools. Deborah talked about the importance of studies and how he would need to dedicate himself to take over his father's business in the future. Rebecca spent almost the entire time talking about the theme park she had visited, promising to take him if his father made the right decision. Fiona was the only one who actually asked Lucas about his pebbles, letting him explain in his own words why he collected them. "Each one represents a day since my mother left," he confessed, surprising himself with the honesty. Fiona nodded, without the forced smile of the others. "The pain doesn't disappear, we just learn to carry it," she said simply. Back in the room, the adults were animatedly conversing about trips, investments, and the latest sophisticated restaurants in Chicago. Lucas, feeling suffocated by the false cheerfulness, took advantage of a moment of distraction to sneak away. He crossed the corridor that led to the kitchen, where he found Patricia preparing a tea tray. "Hey, champ," she said, immediately noticing his downcast expression. "How's it going?" "Terrible," he answered, sitting on one of the high stools. "They're all fake." Patricia didn't disagree or try to convince him otherwise. Instead, she offered a piece of the chocolate cake they had made together the night before. "This will cheer you up a bit. Then I need to take the tea to the living room. Your father must be looking for you. Can I stay here with you?" "You know I can't allow that. Your father would be very angry with me." Lucas bit his lip, feeling his eyes burn. "I don't want to go back there." Seeing the boy's desperation, Patricia made a decision that she knew could cost her her job. "Come with me," she said, leading him out of the kitchen through a side door that opened to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the eyes of the main room. There, under the generous shade of an avocado tree, Patricia had installed a small hammock between two trees where Lucas sometimes rested on hot afternoons. "Stay here for a while, I'll deliver the tea and then come back for you." "Promise?" "I promise." While Lucas settled into the hammock, Patricia returned to the house carrying the tray to the room where the candidates were waiting. Edward received her with a questioning look. "Where is my son?" "Young Lucas asked for a few minutes, sir." "He said he would return soon," she replied, maintaining her composure while serving the tea. Edward frowned but didn't want to create a scene in front of the guests. Christine took the opportunity to comment on how children could be temperamental at times, while Helen offered her expertise in effective discipline. 15 minutes passed without any sign of Lucas. Edward, increasingly irritated, excused himself and went in search of his son, discreetly followed by Patricia. They found him exactly where she had left him, swinging gently in the hammock, looking at the sky through the leaves of the tree. "Lucas, what does this mean? We have guests. Waiting, and you simply disappear," reprimanded Edward, his voice tense with contained anger. "I don't like them," the boy answered with disarming simplicity. "It's not a question of liking or not liking. It's about respect and manners. Now come immediately." "I don't want to." The direct response made Edward's face redden. "I'm not asking if you want to, I'm telling you to come." Patricia, sensing the dangerously escalating tension, intervened. "Mr. Mitchell, perhaps Lucas needs a moment to compose himself. I can stay with him while you entertain the guests." "This is not your business, Patricia. You should be in the kitchen, not meddling in family matters." The rawness of the words hit Patricia like a slap, but she stood firm. "With all due respect, sir, I believe forcing Lucas now will only make the situation worse." Edward looked from Patricia to his son, noticing how the boy seemed more relaxed and secure in the employee's presence than he had been all afternoon with the carefully selected candidates. 5 minutes, he finally conceded. Not a second more. When Edward returned to the house, Lucas looked at Patricia with gratitude. "I don't want to choose any of them." "I understand, but your father is trying to do what he thinks is best." "He doesn't know what's best. He never does." Patricia sat on the grass beside the hammock, reaching for Lucas's small hand. Sometimes grown-ups get so busy thinking about the future that they forget to ask what we really need in the present. "If I could choose," began Lucas, his voice faltering. "What would you choose?" "I would choose you," he answered simply. "You really listen to me. You don't pretend to like me just because my dad is." "Rich?" The words hit Patricia with unexpected force, awakening emotions she had been trying to keep under control since she began working in that house. Before she could respond, Edward reappeared, accompanied by all 5 candidates, who insisted on seeing the special corner where Lucas was hiding. "What's going on here?" questioned Edward, observing the proximity between his son and the employee. Lucas, in a rare moment of courage, stood up from the hammock and announced, in front of everyone, "Dad, if I have to choose someone to be my new mother, I choose Patricia." The silence that followed was deafening. The expressions of the candidates varied between shock, indignation, and poorly disguised contempt. Edward seemed to have been struck by lightning, unable to process what he had just heard. Patricia, completely caught by surprise, felt the world spin around her. Edward's gaze upon her quickly transformed from astonishment to icy fury. An icy silence fell over the Mitchell garden. The 5 women looked at Patricia with a mixture of disdain and disbelief, as if the domestic employee had orchestrated the entire situation. Edward, still paralyzed by his son's declaration, quickly regained his composure, his face assuming the impassive mask he usually wore in difficult negotiations. "Lucas, apologize to our guests and go back inside." "Now," he ordered, each word pronounced with cutting precision. The boy didn't move, holding his father's gaze with surprising determination for someone so young. "I won't apologize for telling the truth." Edward took a step forward, but it was Fiona who intervened, positioning herself between father and son. "It's all right, Edward. Children are honest, and that's a rare quality nowadays," she said, with an understanding smile for Lucas. "Perhaps it's better if we continue our visit another time." The other candidates, however, didn't show the same understanding. Christine adjusted her perfectly straightened hair, casting a venomous look at Patricia. "I always knew it was a mistake to let employees get too close to children. They confuse the poor little heads," Helen agreed, adding in a professorial tone. "It's a classic case of emotional manipulation. The child, vulnerable from the loss of his mother, attaches himself to the first female figure who shows attention. Quite predictable, actually." Patricia, who until then had remained silent, felt her blood boil at the insinuations. "Excuse me, but I haven't manipulated anyone. I simply treated Lucas as he deserves to be treated, with respect and consideration for his feelings." "Enough!" Edward cut in, his face tense with contained anger. "Patricia, to my office now! Margaret!" he called the housekeeper, who was observing the scene from afar. "Take Lucas to his room and stay with him." While Margaret led a reluctant Lucas back into the house, Edward turned to the guests, forcing a diplomatic smile. "Ladies, I sincerely apologize for this embarrassing incident. Shall we continue our afternoon in the main room? Augusto will serve drinks while I resolve this situation." Rebecca, the influencer, was already pulling her phone from her purse, barely disguising her interest in recording the drama. This would make incredible content. "I mean, what an unfortunate situation," she corrected herself upon noticing Edward's stern look. Deborah, the lawyer, assumed a professional posture. "Edward, if you need guidance on how to deal with employees who cross boundaries, I'm at your disposal. I have some experience in labor law." As the women were led back to the house by Augusto, the butler, Edward gestured for Patricia to follow him to his office. The path was traversed in tense silence, with Patricia feeling each step as if she were walking to her own sentence. Edward's office was an imposing environment, decorated in dark tones, with a massive mahogany desk and shelves filled with books that Patricia suspected had never been opened. He closed the door and walked to the window, his back to her, hands crossed behind his body. "Explain yourself," he demanded without turning around. Patricia breathed deeply, seeking words that could express the complexity of the situation without worsening her already precarious position. "Mr. Mitchell, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Lucas is going through a difficult time and—" "Misunderstanding?" he interrupted, turning abruptly. "My son just announced in front of 5 of the most influential women in Westfield that he prefers the domestic employee as his mother. This is not a misunderstanding, Patricia. It's a humiliation." "It was not my intention for this to happen," she replied, keeping her voice firm despite the internal tremor. "I never encouraged Lucas to make such a declaration." Edward approached, evaluating her with calculating eyes. "How long have you been planning this? Since when have you been manipulating my son to gain his trust? What do you hope to achieve?" The unjust accusation hit Patricia like a physical blow. Her eyes burned with tears of indignation that she refused to shed. "With all due respect, sir, I'm not interested in your money or position. I have a degree in education. I worked as a teacher for 7 years before the school where I taught closed. I needed the job, yes, but I never had any intention beyond doing my work with dignity." Edward gave a dry laugh, devoid of humor. "Education, of course, that explains how you knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. Sir, if I may, what Lucas needs is not a new mother chosen as if it were a beauty pageant. He needs time to process his loss, space to express his feelings, and most importantly, to know that he is heard and valued." "I don't need advice on how to raise my son," cut in Edward, slamming his hand on the desk. "What I need are employees who know their place and don't cross boundaries." Patricia straightened her shoulders, deciding that if she would be fired anyway, she might as well tell the truth. "Lucas is suffering. He keeps a photo album of his mother under his mattress because he's afraid you'll throw it away. He collects pebbles, counting the days since she left. He wakes up crying almost every night but refuses to call for you because he knows you'll say that men don't cry." Edward's face paled slightly, but his expression remained impassive. "You're fired, Patricia. I want you to pack your things and leave this house by the end of the day. You'll receive all your rights, but don't expect references." The sentence, although expected, still hurt, not for the lost job, but for what it would mean for Lucas. "May I at least say goodbye to him?" "Absolutely not. Margaret will explain to him that you had to leave the job for personal reasons. The less drama, the better." Patricia nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "I understand. May I request only that you pay more attention to the signs Lucas has been showing? He's developing worrying symptoms of childhood depression. I'll take care of my son in my own way. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests waiting." Without further words, Patricia left the office, walking through the corridors of the mansion as if traversing a nebulous dream. In the service area, she found Susan, the cook, who immediately noticed something serious had happened. "My God, girl, what happened? You're white as paper." "I was fired," Patricia answered, the words sounding strange in her own ears. "What? Why?" "It's a long story. I need to pack my things." As Patricia packed her belongings in the small staff bedroom, she fought against the growing concern for Lucas. How would he react when he discovered she had left without saying goodbye? How would Edward explain the situation? And, most importantly, what would happen to the boy now, surrounded by adults who didn't understand his pain? On the upper floor, unaware of Patricia's dismissal, Lucas was sitting on the bed, arms crossed, refusing to respond to Margaret's attempts at conversation. "Young Lucas, your father was very disappointed with your behavior today," the housekeeper was saying, meticulously arranging the pillows the boy had thrown on the floor. "Those ladies came especially to meet you." "I didn't ask them to come," Lucas replied dryly. "Even so, it was very impolite of you. Especially that comment about Patricia." Lucas raised his eyes, defiant. "I spoke the truth. I prefer her to any of those fake women." Margaret sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I understand that you've become attached to Patricia. She's a good person. But Lucas, she's an employee, not part of the family. Your father is trying to rebuild a home for you, with someone of the same social level." "I don't care about social level. I care about who really likes me." The conversation was interrupted by knocks on the door. Edward entered, still wearing the impeccable suit, though his tie was slightly loose, the only visible sign of his stress. "Margaret, would you give us some privacy?" The housekeeper nodded and silently left, closing the door behind her. Edward sat in the chair near his son's desk, maintaining a calculated distance. "Lucas, we need to talk about what happened today." The boy remained silent, looking at his own hands. "What you did was extremely inappropriate and embarrassing. Not just for me, but for our guests who came with the best intentions." "They don't care about me," muttered Lucas. "They just want your money and the house." Edward frowned, surprised by his son's keen perception. "That's not true. They are. Women from good families, successful, who could add a lot to our lives." "I prefer Patricia." Edward breathed deeply, preparing for what would come next. "About that." "Patricia no longer works here." Lucas's face transformed instantly, his eyes widening in shock. "What did you do?" "She crossed professional boundaries, Lucas. She couldn't continue working in our home after what happened." "You sent her away? Because of me?" asked the boy, his voice trembling. "I made the decision I considered best for our family." Lucas jumped from the bed, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and despair. "She's the only person who understands me. The only one who makes me feel better since Mum left." "That's not true, Lucas. You have me, you have Margaret, you have your teachers." "You're never here," shouted the boy, tears freely streaming down his face. "And when you are, you only talk about work or keep telling me how I should behave." The emotional explosion caught Edward off guard. He rarely saw his son demonstrate such intensity of feelings. "I'm doing the best I can, Lucas. I work hard to secure your future so that you have all the opportunities you deserve." "I don't want opportunities. I want my mom back. And since that's impossible, I at least wanted to have Patricia, but you took her from me too." Edward stood up, trying to approach his son, but Lucas backed away. "She'll come back, won't she? You can rehire her, can't you?" "No, Lucas, that decision is final." The boy's expression hardened, giving way to something Edward had never seen before, a cold, adult contempt that seemed completely out of place on the childish face. "I hate you," said Lucas, each word pronounced with painful clarity. "You only care about what others think. You never cared about how I feel." The words hit Edward like a physical blow. He extended his hand, trying to touch his son's shoulder, but Lucas moved away abruptly. "Get out of my room." "Lucas, I'm your father. Don't speak to me that way." "Get out!" Edward backed away, stunned by the violence of the reaction. He decided that perhaps it would be better to give his son some time to calm down. "We'll talk when you're calmer. I'll ask Susan to bring your dinner here." Without a response, Edward left, gently closing the door. In the hallway, he met Margaret, who had obviously heard part of the discussion. "He'll get over it, sir," she said, trying to comfort her employer. "Children are resilient." Edward nodded distractedly, his thoughts already on the guests he had left waiting in the main room. He needed to go back, keep up appearances, save what was left of that disastrous afternoon. In the room, alone, Lucas opened the drawer of the bedside table and took out a small wooden box. Inside was a card with the phone number Patricia had given him once for emergencies. With trembling fingers, he hid the card under his pillow. That same night, while the mansion slept, Lucas refused to touch the food that was brought to him. For the first time since his mother's departure, he didn't even try to sleep. He remained seated by the window, observing the moon that illuminated the garden where, hours before, his life had completely changed. In her small apartment in downtown Westfield, Patricia also couldn't sleep. Worried about Lucas, she tossed and turned in bed, mentally reviewing the day's events and questioning whether she could have done anything differently. The phone on the nightstand remained silent, but she couldn't help looking at it every few minutes, as if expecting a call she knew was unlikely. Edward, for his part, was in his office, a glass of whiskey in hand, reviewing the profiles of the candidates on his tablet. Despite the afternoon fiasco, 3 of them, Christine, Helen and Fiona, had expressed interest in continuing the selection process. The other two made polite excuses, but made it clear that the situation with the problematic boy was not what they expected. Fiona, surprisingly, had been the most understanding, sending a private message to Edward after leaving. "Your son is a sensitive and intelligent boy, just suffering from a loss he hasn't fully processed yet. Perhaps what he needs is not a new mother now, but time and understanding. Think about it, Edward, and when you're ready to talk, without pressures or expectations, you know where to find me." Edward stared at the message for long minutes before closing it without responding. Lucas's voice echoed in his mind, "I hate you." How had they reached this point? When had the abyss between him and his son become so vast? And more importantly, would it still be possible to build a bridge over it? 3 weeks passed since the incident in the garden. The Mitchell mansion, always quiet, now seemed enveloped in an almost palpable stillness. The staff moved through the corridors like shadows, speaking in whispers, avoiding any action that might disturb the fragile balance of the house. Lucas had transformed. The already reserved boy had become practically mute. He attended school at his father's insistence, but teachers reported that he didn't participate in activities, didn't interact with classmates, and was often found alone in the schoolyard during breaks. At home, he locked himself in his room for hours, refused meals, and rarely responded when someone addressed him. Edward observed the change with growing concern, but remained faithful to his decision. On the few occasions when he mentioned Patricia's name, suggesting that Lucas should overcome that inappropriate fixation, his son simply got up and left the room, leaving him talking to himself. That Wednesday morning, Edward was in his office when Margaret knocked on the door. "Mr. Mitchell, Lucas's school is on the line. The principal would like to speak with you urgently." Edward frowned, picking up the phone. "Edward Mitchell speaking." "Mr. Mitchell, this is Regina Alvarez, principal of Elite Academy. We need you to come pick up Lucas immediately." "Did something happen?" "He had an episode. During physical education class, when one of the teachers insisted he participate in the game, Lucas had an uncontrollable crying fit, followed by difficulty breathing. Our nurse identified it as an anxiety attack. He's calmer now, but we thought it prudent for him to return home and receive appropriate care." Edward felt his stomach sink. In 9 years, Lucas had never presented problems of this kind. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. At the school, he found his son sitting in an armchair in the infirmary, staring fixedly at the floor, his impeccable uniform contrasting with his pale face and swollen eyes. "Lucas?" he called softly, kneeling to be at the boy's level. No response. The nurse approached, speaking in a professional tone. "He's stable now, Mr. Mitchell, but I strongly recommend a consultation with a specialist. Episodes like this may be indicative of more serious emotional problems." "I understand. Thank you for taking care of him." In the car, Edward tried various approaches. Direct questions about what had happened, comments about the weather, even the promise of a new video game. Lucas remained silent, his gaze lost in the landscape passing by the window. At home, the boy went straight to his room, ignoring Margaret's calls for lunch. Edward, confronted with his own powerlessness in the face of the situation, decided to call Fiona Taylor, the only one of the candidates who had seemed genuinely concerned about Lucas's well-being. "Edward, what a surprise," she answered, after 2 rings. "Fiona, sorry to bother you, but I need some advice." The hesitation in his voice, something rare for the always confident businessman, made Fiona realize the gravity of the situation. "What happened?" Edward related the events of the past few weeks, culminating with the episode at school that morning. Fiona listened attentively without interrupting. "He doesn't eat properly, barely speaks, spends hours isolated. I've tried everything. Gifts, promises, even threats of punishment. Nothing works." "Edward," said Fiona after a pause, "have you considered that perhaps you're dealing with something more serious than simple childhood rebellion?" "What do you mean?" "The symptoms you describe, isolation, loss of appetite, anxiety attacks, are consistent with childhood depression. Children don't process loss the same way adults do. The absence of his mother now added to the loss of a reference figure like Patricia. Patricia was just an employee, Edward cut in, the defensiveness evident in his voice. For you, perhaps, but for Lucas, she clearly meant much more. Children don't attach to jobs or social positions. Edward, they connect with those who make them feel safe and loved. The words hit Edward with unexpected force. For a moment he remembered how Emily, his late wife, always said that the greatest fortune they could leave for Lucas wasn't in bank accounts or properties, but in memories of affection and presence. What do you suggest I do? First, take him to a child psychologist immediately. Then, well, perhaps it's time to reconsider some recent decisions. After hanging up, Edward remained in his office for long minutes, contemplating the framed photograph on the desk, the only image of Emily he had kept displayed, showing her pregnant, with Lucas radiant under the sun of an afternoon at Malibu Beach. What would you do, Emily? He murmured to the silence. The answer, he knew, would probably involve putting their son's emotional well-being above social conventions and his own pride. That same afternoon, following Fiona's advice, Edward took Lucas to an emergency consultation with Dr. Camilla Rocha, a renowned child psychologist in Westfield. While the boy underwent the initial evaluation, Edward waited in the waiting room, absently leafing through magazines about child development that would never have captured his interest before. After almost an hour, the doctor called him for a conversation in her office, leaving Lucas under the supervision of an assistant. Mr. Mitchell, I conducted a preliminary evaluation, and I'm quite concerned about Lucas's emotional state, began Dr. Rocha, adjusting her colorful framed glasses. He presents clear signs of severe childhood depression, aggravated by unprocessed grief and recent losses. Edward nodded, trying to process the information. How serious is it? Quite serious. Childhood depression is not just passing sadness. It affects development, learning, social relationships, and in extreme cases, can lead to self-destructive thoughts. The mention of the possibility of Lucas harming himself made Edward visibly pale. What can we do? I recommend weekly therapy sessions to start. It would also be important to evaluate the need for psychiatric monitoring, depending on the evolution. But, Mr. Mitchell, beyond clinical treatment, Lucas urgently needs to recover meaningful, emotional connections in his daily life. Are you referring to the domestic employee I fired? Asked Edward, the defensiveness returning to his voice. Dr. Rocha looked at him directly, without backing down. I'm referring to anyone who represents emotional security for Lucas at this moment. During our conversation, he mentioned this woman, Patricia, correct, several times. He described her as the only one who understood and who didn't pretend to like him. Edward massaged his temples, feeling a headache forming. Doctor, I understand your concern, but there are complications. Reintroducing Patricia into our lives is not so simple. Mr. Mitchell, with all due respect, what isn't simple is seeing a 9-year-old child struggling against a condition that can affect his entire future life. Depression in childhood, when not properly treated, frequently resurfaces in adolescence and adulthood, with potentially devastating consequences. The doctor's words weighed on Edward like lead. During the entire journey back home, he observed Lucas from the corner of his eye, noticing details he had ignored in recent weeks, how his shoulders were hunched, how his clothes seemed looser. On his skinny body, how even the characteristic sparkle in his eyes, so similar to Emily's, seemed to have gone out. At home, as Lucas went straight to his room, Edward was intercepted by Margaret. Sir, the school called. The math teacher sent an email saying Lucas hasn't turned in any assignments in the last 2 weeks and fell asleep during class today. Edward nodded distractedly, still absorbing the conversation with the psychologist. Oh, and Ms. Christine and Ms. Helen called asking about the next meeting. I left the messages on your desk. Something about that phrase awakened a sudden irritation in Edward. Cancel any appointments with them. Say we are unavailable for an indefinite period. The expression of surprise on the housekeeper's face didn't go unnoticed. Sir? Are you sure? Ms. Christine mentioned something about tickets to the Chicago Symphony. Absolutely sure, Margaret. And please ask Augusto to bring me a whiskey in the office. Alone with his thoughts, Edward tried to reconcile his pride and convictions with the painful reality that presented itself. He had always been a man of quick and assertive decisions in business, but now, faced with a crisis that couldn't be resolved with money or power, he felt completely lost. The second, meeting with the candidates, organized 2 weeks after the incident with Patricia, had been even more disastrous than the first. Lucas, already visibly downcast, had refused to come down to greet the 3 women who agreed to return. When Edward finally convinced him to appear, under threat of taking away his tablet, the boy remained completely apathetic, responding only with monosyllables to attempts at conversation. Christine, impatient with the boy's behavior, had committed the fatal mistake of grabbing his arm when he tried to leave in the middle of her explanation about the educational cruise she was planning. For the holidays. Lucas, it's extremely rude to leave while an adult is talking. Didn't they teach you manners? The pull, although not violent, was enough to trigger an explosive reaction in the boy, who shouted for her not to touch him and ran back to his room, leaving the adults in shock. Edward, divided between embarrassment at the scene and anger at Christine's aggressive approach, ended up terminating the meeting prematurely. Later, when checking on Lucas, he found him curled up under the covers, trembling as if he had a fever. Now, reviewing these events in light of the medical diagnosis, Edward began to see his own participation in his son's suffering. Perhaps his desire to rebuild a perfect family had more to do with appearances and social expectations than with Lucas's real emotional needs. Margaret interrupted his thoughts, knocking softly on the half-open door. "Sir, dinner is served." "Has Lucas come down?" "No, sir. I took a tray to his room, but he barely touched the food." Edward sighed, putting the whiskey glass on the desk. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm not hungry." The housekeeper hesitated at the door, as if wanting to say something more. Edward raised his eyes, noticing her concerned expression. "Is there a problem?" "Mr. Mitchell, I know it's not my place to give opinions, but I've worked in this house for 15 years. I saw young Lucas born, grow up. I've never seen him so dimmed as now." Edward nodded, surprising himself by asking, "What do you think I should do, Margaret?" The housekeeper, caught by surprise by the unusual openness of her employer, responded cautiously, Perhaps that young woman Patricia wasn't such a bad influence after all. The boy smiled when she was around. He ate better, slept better since she left." "I understand. Sorry for the intrusion, sir." "No, Margaret, thank you for your honesty." When the housekeeper left, Edward turned to the window, observing the night falling over the mansion's gardens. Outside, the world continued, cars passing on the distant avenue, lights turning on in neighboring houses, families gathering for dinner. Inside those walls, protected by state-of-the-art security systems, however, something much more valuable was being lost. After a few minutes of contemplation, Edward took the phone and dialed a number he had obtained earlier through contacts at the company. "Hello?" answered a female voice, hesitant. "Patricia, this is Edward Mitchell." The silence on the other end of the line was laden with surprise and tension. "Mr. Mitchell, how can I help you?" The formality in her voice made him realize how much the abrupt dismissal must have affected her. Patricia had left the mansion the same day without a chance to say goodbye to Lucas or explain the situation to the boy. "Patricia, I'm calling because Lucas is not well." Edward briefly explained the situation, the visit to the psychologist, the preliminary diagnosis, the visible deterioration of his son's state. As he spoke, he felt a growing lump in his throat, something he hadn't experienced since the day Emily had left. "I'm sorry to hear that," Patricia replied, her voice now laden with genuine concern. "Lucas is an extraordinary boy. I've been thinking about him every day. The psychologist and Margaret and even Fiona, one of the women you met that day, all suggest that the sudden absence of your presence in his life contributed to his current state." "I understand." Edward breathed deeply, forcing himself to pronounce the words his pride was reluctant to form. I would like to know if you would be willing to visit Lucas. Just a visit to start. For him to know that you're well, that you haven't completely disappeared from his life. The silence on the other end of the line extended for a few seconds, until Patricia finally responded. Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your call, and I am truly concerned about Lucas. But I need to ask, would this visit be just to temporarily calm the boy, or are you really willing to re-evaluate your position on my relationship with your son? The direct question caught Edward off guard. He was accustomed to employees who simply complied with his decisions, not to people who questioned him so frankly. I am open to reconsidering my previous decisions, depending on what's best for Lucas's health. In that case, I can visit him tomorrow afternoon, after my shift at the community center where I'm currently working. Community center. Yes, I'm giving tutoring classes to underprivileged children at Oakwood Community Center. The salary is much lower than what I received at your house, but the work is rewarding. Something in the simplicity of that response made Edward question his previous assumptions about Patricia's intentions. Perhaps Helen and Christine had been wrong. Perhaps Lucas, in his childish but acute perception, had seen something that he, blinded by prejudices and social conventions, had failed to see. Would 4 o'clock be convenient? He asked, consulting his mental schedule. Yes, I can be there at that time. Thank you, Patricia. And I apologize for the way things ended. The admission, though vague, of his mistake seemed to surprise Patricia as much as it did himself. See you tomorrow, Mr. Mitchell. Edward hung up, feeling a mixture of anxiety and relief. He had taken the first step to correct a mistake, but the path ahead still seemed fraught with uncertainties. How would Lucas react to the reunion? How to balance his son's emotional need with the social conventions that had always guided his life? And mainly, what place would Patricia occupy in this new configuration that was beginning to take shape? The next morning brought a slight change in the atmosphere of the mansion. Edward, who normally left early for the office, informed the housekeeper that he would work from home that day. When Margaret, surprised, asked if she should prepare his breakfast in the office as usual, he replied, "No, Margaret, I'll have breakfast with Lucas in the dining room." The housekeeper couldn't hide her astonishment. "Young Lucas usually has breakfast in his room, sir. Today will be different. Please let him know I'm waiting for him." 15 minutes later, Lucas appeared at the dining room door, still in his pajamas, with tousled hair and dark circles under his eyes. He hesitated for a moment upon seeing his father seated at the table, consulting his tablet while having a cup of coffee. "Good morning, Lucas," said Edward, putting the device aside. "Please sit down." The boy obeyed in silence, watching with suspicion as Margaret served orange juice and pancakes with chocolate syrup, his favorite breakfast, something that hadn't been served in the house since Emily's departure. "Didn't you need to go to the office today?" Lucas finally asked, his voice hoarse from little use. "I decided to work from home. I thought we could talk." Lucas began to poke at the pancake with his fork without really eating. "I'm not hungry." Edward observed his son, noticing how his wrists seemed thinner, how his cheekbones were more prominent. Dr. Rocha had mentioned that weight loss was one of the worrying symptoms of childhood depression. "Lucas, I know the last few weeks have been difficult. After the consultation with Dr. Rocha yesterday, I've been thinking a lot about what you need." The boy raised his eyes, a spark of interest appearing in his apathetic gaze. "I spoke with Patricia last night," continued Edward, carefully observing his son's reaction. The effect was immediate. Lucas straightened in his chair, the fork suspended in the air. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice suddenly animated. "Yes, she is. In fact, she agreed to come visit you this afternoon." Lucas's eyes widened, lighting up with the first spark of genuine happiness in weeks. "Is she coming back home?" Edward hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "For now, it's just a visit. But I'm open to reconsidering some decisions, depending on what's best for you. Will you give her job back? We'll talk about that later, with her present. The important thing now is that you eat something. Patricia will be worried if she sees you so thin. The strategy worked. Lucas cut a piece of the pancake and brought it to his mouth, chewing slowly. Edward felt immense relief at seeing his son finally eating without resistance. "What time is she coming?" "At 4 in the afternoon, after your English lesson," Lucas frowned. "I don't want to go to school today." "You won't. Dr. Rocha recommended a few days at home until we start the therapy sessions, but your English teacher will come for the private lesson, as always." The boy nodded, returning to eat with renewed interest. Edward watched, amazed at the sudden transformation. A simple mention of Patricia had accomplished what weeks of expensive gifts and attempts at dialogue had not achieved. "Dad," called Lucas after a few minutes of silence. "Yes?" "Thank you." The simple word, pronounced with childlike sincerity, hit Edward with unexpected force. How many times in the last 2 years had he really heard his son express gratitude spontaneously? How many genuine moments had they shared without the shadow of expectations or obligations? "You're welcome, son." The rest of breakfast passed in a more comfortable silence. Afterward, Edward retired to his office, while Lucas, surprisingly, asked to use the pool, something he hadn't done in months. Observing his son swimming through the office window, Edward felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Patricia's visit seemed to have given Lucas something to look forward to with anticipation. But what about afterward? What would be the next step? Around noon, while Edward was conducting a video conference with investors, his cell phone vibrated with a message from Fiona. "How is Lucas today? Did you manage to schedule the appointment with the psychologist?" The genuine concern in the text made him smile slightly. He responded briefly, promising to call later with details. There was something about Fiona, a direct honesty, without games or manipulations, that strongly contrasted with the other candidates. Perhaps, thought Edward, when all this situation was resolved, they could resume the conversation interrupted on that fateful day. At 1 o'clock, the English teacher arrived for Lucas's private lesson. To everyone's surprise, the boy not only attended the session, but actively participated, asking questions and completing exercises he had ignored in previous weeks. "Remarkable improvement, Mr. Mitchell," commented the teacher at the end of the lesson. "Lucas seems much more present today." Edward thanked him without explaining the reason for the sudden change in his son's behavior. How could he say that the prospect of seeing a domestic employee had cheered Lucas more than all the exclusive educational opportunities that money could buy? As the afternoon progressed, Lucas's anxiety became increasingly evident. He changed, closed 3 times, combed his hair with unusual care, and even asked Margaret to tidy his room as something he normally completely ignored. "Will she come up to see me in my room?" he asked Edward, who smiled at his son's agitation. "We'll see. First, we'll all talk in the living room." At 15 minutes to 4, Lucas was already posted at the window of the main room, watching the entrance gate. Edward, pretending to review documents on the sofa, couldn't avoid looking at the clock every few minutes. Exactly at 4 o'clock, the intercom rang. Augusto, the butler, announced Patricia's arrival. Edward breathed deeply, preparing for the reunion that could change the course of their lives. When Patricia entered the room, Edward was struck by an unexpected observation. He had never really looked at her before. He had always seen her as the employee, efficient, discreet, part of the house's operation, but not as a person with her own identity. Today, she wore a simple but elegant dress, navy blue, with her hair loose, framing a face that, he realized, was not only pretty but expressive and intelligent. She carried a small gift bag in her hands and seemed slightly nervous, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. "Patricia!" exclaimed Lucas, running to hug her with an energy Edward hadn't seen in months. She bent down, receiving the tight hug from the boy, her eyes briefly closing in an expression of relief and joy. "Lucas, I've missed you so much," she said, moving away a bit to look at him better. "You've lost weight. Have you been eating properly?" The boy shrugged, still holding her hands as if afraid she might disappear again. "I haven't been hungry, but today I ate pancakes for breakfast." "That's good. We need to get those cheeks back, she smiled, lightly touching his face. Edward approached, extending his hand formally. Thank you for coming, Patricia. She accepted the greeting, the contact brief and professional. Mr. Mitchell. An uncomfortable silence followed the greeting, broken by Lucas pulling Patricia by the hand. Come see my room. I cleaned everything today. Patricia looked at Edward, seeking approval. He nodded. You can go. I'll ask Margaret to serve tea in a little while. As the two went up the stairs, Lucas talking animatedly for the first time in weeks, Edward felt a pang of jealousy? No, it wasn't quite that. It was something more complex, a mixture of gratitude for seeing his son happy again and discomfort at not having been the cause of that happiness. In Lucas's room, Patricia listened attentively while the boy showed his recent drawings, all in dark and somber tones, reflecting his emotional state of the past weeks. I did this one yesterday, he said, showing a particularly disturbing drawing, a small figure, alone in a vast and empty space. Is that you? Patricia asked softly. Lucas nodded. I was very angry at my dad for sending you away. I still am, a little. Patricia sat on the edge of the bed, pulling Lucas to her side. Your father made that decision thinking it was best for you two. Adults sometimes make mistakes, even when they have good intentions. Weren't you angry with him? The question caught Patricia by surprise. She reflected for a moment before responding with honesty. I was hurt, yes, and worried about you, but I also understood that your father was in a difficult situation. Lucas looked at her with that peculiar intensity of children when they realize they're receiving a genuine answer, not a diluted version of the truth. Why did you come back? Because I care about you, Lucas. And when your father told me you weren't well, I couldn't simply ignore it. The boy hugged her again, tightly. You won't leave again, promise? Patricia hesitated, aware of the weight of a promise to a child, who had already lost so much. I can't promise something that doesn't depend only on me, but I can guarantee that even if I'm not here every day, I will always be present in your life in some way. Lucas seemed to accept the answer, although not completely satisfied. Then he remembered. What's in the bag you brought? Patricia smiled, handing him the small package. Open it and find out. Lucas tore the paper enthusiastically, revealing a book with a colorful cover, The Little Prince. It's the story of a boy who lives alone on a small planet, explained Patricia. He learns that what is essential is invisible to the eye. Will you read it to me? If your father allows, I would. Love to. At that moment, Margaret knocked softly on the door, announcing that tea was served on the veranda. Lucas, still holding the book, went down the stairs hand in hand with Patricia, an image that didn't go unnoticed by Edward, who was waiting for them. During tea, the transformation in Lucas was evident. He ate 2 pieces of cake, chatted animatedly about school, asked Patricia about her new job at the community center, and even occasionally included his father in the conversation, something he hadn't done in weeks. Edward, observing the interaction, felt simultaneously relieved by his son's visible improvement and disturbed by the undeniable evidence that he had made a serious mistake in removing Patricia so abruptly. When Lucas momentarily moved away to fetch something from his room, Edward took the opportunity to speak to Patricia in a low voice. The change in him is impressive. Patricia nodded, smiling slightly. He's a strong boy, Mr. Mitchell. He just needs to feel seen and heard. The psychologist mentioned that you represented a figure of emotional security for him. I tried to be a constant support when I realized how much he was suffering. Often children can't express their pain with words, so they seek other means: isolation, rebellion, or in Lucas's case, silence. Edward felt a reluctant admiration for the insight of this woman who, until recently, he considered just an employee without greater importance to his family. Patricia, I know our last meeting ended abruptly, but I would like to propose something. She looked at him cautiously. I'm listening. Lucas clearly needs your presence. The psychologist recommended that he maintain contact with people who bring him emotional security. I would like to know if you would consider returning to this house." Patricia maintained a steady gaze without showing surprise or excitement at the offer. "Under what conditions, Mr. Mitchell?" The direct question caught him off guard. He was accustomed to employees who accepted job offers without questioning. The same as before, salary, benefits, days off. "I'm not referring to that," interrupted Patricia, with a confidence Edward had never noticed before. "I'm referring to my relationship with Lucas. Will I be allowed to be the emotional support he needs, or will I be constantly reminded of my place as an employee?" Edward felt his face heat up. The precision with which she exposed the central issue left him momentarily speechless. "I recognize that I erred in removing you so drastically. Lucas clearly formed an important bond with you, and it's not up to me to destroy that." Patricia studied him for a moment, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Mitchell, but I need a day to think. My work at the community center is important, and I can't simply abandon it without a suitable replacement." "I understand. Perhaps you could continue with both, part-time here, part-time there." The suggestion seemed to surprise her positively. "That could work, yes. I need to check with the center's coordination." Lucas returned at that moment, carrying his photo album, the one he kept hidden under the mattress. He opened it, on the table, showing it to Patricia. "Look what I have. These are photos of my mom." Edward felt a tightness in his chest upon seeing the images his son kept hidden. They were mainly photographs of Emily in everyday moments, cooking, reading in the garden, playing with baby Lucas. Simple moments of domestic happiness that, in his pain, Edward had tried to erase from the house, removing all photos from the walls and shelves. "She was beautiful," commented Patricia softly. "How you have her eyes?" "Everyone always said that," replied Lucas, glancing sideways at his father as if fearing his reaction. To the surprise of both, Edward extended his hand, lightly touching a photograph where Emily smiled, holding newborn Lucas in her arms. "Your mother loved this photo," he said, his voice slightly choked. "She said it was the happiest moment of her life." Lucas looked at his father with astonishment. It was the first time in 2 years that Edward had mentioned Emily in such a direct and emotional way. "Do you miss her?" asked the boy hesitantly. Edward met his son's gaze, allowing himself, for the first time since Emily's departure, to show his vulnerability. "Every day, son. Every day." Something broke between them at that instant. An invisible barrier that Edward had erected, believing to protect both himself and his son from the pain of loss. Lucas's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness like in previous weeks. There was relief in them, as if he finally received permission to feel his own pain. Patricia observed the scene with discretion, aware of witnessing a crucial moment in the reconnection between father and son. "She would want us to keep talking about her," said Lucas, surprising Edward with his perception, "not letting her disappear from photos and conversations." Edward nodded, unable to speak for a moment. He felt a gentle hand touch his arm, Patricia's, offering silent support in the face of the emotion that engulfed him. "You're right, Lucas. Your mother deserves to be remembered, not just in hidden photos, but in our conversations, in our hearts." The rest of the afternoon passed in a different atmosphere. The three remained on the veranda until sunset, Lucas leafing through the album, sharing stories about Emily, some of which Edward didn't know. Small moments between mother and son that had remained as the boy's private treasures. When the time came for Patricia to leave, Lucas became anxious again. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, holding her hand. She looked at Edward, who nodded slightly. "Yes, I'll return tomorrow, and I brought a copy of the book for us to start reading together, remember?" Lucas smiled, more at ease with the promise. "I'll wait for you." Patricia said goodbye to Edward with a formal handshake, but there was something different in the look they exchanged, a mutual understanding, perhaps, that they both wanted the best for Lucas, even if starting from initially opposing viewpoints. "Thank you again for coming," said Edward, accompanying her to the door, "and for everything you did for Lucas while I was absent." Patricia stopped, turning to face him directly. "Mr. Mitchell, Your son is extraordinary, intelligent, sensitive, perceptive. He doesn't need a new mother chosen in a parade of candidates. He needs his father really present, willing to see him as he is, not as the heir who will one day take over your business." The frankness of the words hit Edward with force, but surprisingly didn't offend him. There was truth there, a truth that perhaps he needed to hear for a long time. "I think I still have a lot to learn," he admitted, with an honesty that surprised them both. "We all do," she replied with a gentle smile. "I'll call tomorrow." To confirm the time. As Patricia's car disappeared through the gate, Edward returned to the house, finding Lucas still on the veranda, looking at the sky that was beginning to show the first stars. "Dad?" called the boy without taking his eyes off the horizon. "Yes, Lucas? Thank you for bringing Patricia back." "You're welcome, son." "Dad?" "Yes? Can we put Mom's photos in the living room again?" Edward sat next to his son, putting his arm around his small shoulders. "Yes, Lucas, tomorrow we'll put the photos back." And for the first time in many weeks, the silence between them was not oppressive but comfortable. The silence of two people beginning, slowly, to rebuild a bridge over the abyss that separated them. 3 months passed since Patricia's return to the Mitchell mansion. Spring had arrived in Westfield, bringing not only flowers to the gardens, but also a new atmosphere to the house that, for so long, had seemed just an empty and cold structure. The photographs of Emily, previously hidden in secret albums and closed drawers, now occupied their legitimate place on walls and tables. Edward, initially uncomfortable with the images that evoked painful memories, gradually learned to find comfort in them, small windows to happy moments that had, in fact, existed and deserved to be honored, not erased. Lucas, in turn, visibly flourished. The weekly sessions with Dr. Rocha helped him process the repressed grief, while Patricia's constant presence, now dividing her time between the mansion and the community center, provided the emotional stability he so needed. The dynamics in the house had changed significantly. Patricia was no longer just a domestic employee. She occupied a unique role, indefinable by conventional standards. Formally, she had been hired as Lucas's private tutor, taking advantage of her background in education. In practice, she had become much more: counselor, confidant, and a stabilizing presence for both the boy and, surprisingly, for Edward. That Saturday morning, Edward was having coffee on the veranda, observing Lucas and Patricia in the garden. They worked together in a small flower bed, planting sunflower seedlings that Lucas had brought from school as part of a science project. The naturalness of the interaction between the two, the shared laughter, the patience with which Patricia explained each step of the planting, Lucas's genuine enthusiasm, produced in Edward a complex feeling, a mixture of gratitude and a pang, of something he took time to recognize as envy. "More coffee, sir?" asked Margaret, interrupting his thoughts. "Yes, thank you." As the housekeeper served, Edward noticed her gaze following the same direction as his. "It's good to see young Lucas like this, isn't it?" she commented, allowing herself an unusual familiarity. "Yes, it is," agreed Edward. "I hardly recognize him compared to how he was a few months ago. Miss Patricia has been a blessing. I always knew there was something special about her, from the first day." Edward smiled slightly. Margaret, always so formal and reserved, had developed an evident respect for Patricia, coming to treat her more as an equal than as a subordinate. "Thank you, Margaret, for always being here, even in the most difficult moments." The housekeeper, caught by surprise by the unexpected gratitude, simply nodded with dignity before withdrawing. Edward checked his watch. Within an hour, he would receive a visit that made him strangely nervous. Fiona Taylor had accepted his invitation for lunch. It would be the first social gathering he had organized at the mansion since the disastrous day when the 5 candidates had been introduced to Lucas. This time, however, his intentions were different. In the months following Lucas's crisis, Fiona had proven to be a valuable friend, someone who offered sincere advice, without judgments or expectations. The exchanged messages, initially focused on Lucas's health, gradually evolved into broader conversations, revealing a woman whose intelligence and authenticity Edward had learned to admire. The lunch invitation had no ulterior motives or hidden agendas. It was simply the desire to share the positive transformation that had occurred in his family with someone who had shown genuine concern. "Dad, look what I found!" exclaimed Lucas, running in his direction with something in his hands. Edward smiled at seeing his son so excited, a scene that had become common, but still moved him, considering the contrast with the apathetic boy of months ago. "What do you have there, champ?" "A stone that looks like a heart," Lucas showed, displaying a small pinkish stone, naturally sculpted in a shape similar to a heart. "I'm going to give it to Patricia." Edward felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of emotion and a remnant of jealousy he still struggled to overcome. "I'm sure she'll love it." Lucas hesitated, studying his father's expression. "Do you think Mom would like Patricia?" The question, made with disconcerting childlike frankness, caught Edward off guard. In recent months, Lucas had begun to ask questions like this, direct, sometimes uncomfortable, about how his mother would feel about various situations. "Doctor." Roger had explained that it was a natural part of the grieving process, an attempt to keep the connection with the lost person alive. "I think so, son," replied Edward, after a reflective pause. "Your mother always put your happiness above everything, and Patricia makes you happy, doesn't she?" Lucas nodded emphatically. "She's different from the other women you brought here," he stated, with the raw honesty characteristic of children. "She doesn't want anything from you." The observation hit Edward with surprising precision. It was true. Patricia had never shown interest in his wealth, social position, or the mansion. Her focus had always been exclusively on Lucas's well-being. "You're right," he admitted. "She is different." Lucas smiled, satisfied with his father's agreement, and ran back to the garden where Patricia patiently waited, holding a gardening spade. Edward observed them for a few more moments before getting up. He needed to prepare for Fiona's visit. As he passed through the main corridor, he noticed something that wasn't there the day before, a new picture frame on the side table. The photograph showed Emily, Edward, and Lucas, then only 5 years old, during a picnic at Willow Creek Park. Everyone was smiling, the last rays of the setting sun creating a golden halo around them. Edward touched the frame gently, remembering that day. It had been Emily's idea to drop everything on a Wednesday and spend the afternoon at the park, something completely outside his meticulously planned routine. At the time, he had been reluctant, concerned about meetings and deadlines. Now that spontaneous moment had become one of his most precious memories. "Sir," called Augusto, the butler, approaching discreetly. "Miss Fiona has just arrived." "Thank you, Augusto. Ask her to wait for me in the living room, please. I'll be down in a minute." Edward went to his room, quickly checking his appearance in the mirror. He noticed that he smiled more easily now, that the permanent tension lines on his face had softened. He looked younger in a way, more similar to the man in the photograph in the hallway. Fiona waited in the main room, admiring one of the paintings on the wall. She wore an elegant but unpretentious outfit, tailored pants and a silk blouse in an emerald green tone that highlighted her eyes. Upon seeing him, she smiled with genuine pleasure. "Edward, it's good to see you. And what a change in this house." He followed her gaze around the room, noticing what she had immediately perceived: the family photographs now present, the fresh flowers in colorful vases, the children's books on the coffee table, small signs of a truly inhabited house, not just occupied. "A lot has changed in the last few months," he replied, leading her to the veranda. "Lucas is in the garden planting sunflowers. Would you like to see him?" "I'd love to." As they walked toward the garden, Edward told Fiona about his son's progress, the therapy sessions that helped with grief processing, the return of appetite, and interest in activities, the school grades that were rising again. "And how has it been for you?" she asked, with the direct frankness that Edward had learned to appreciate. "This whole process." "Challenging," he admitted. "I'm learning to be a different father than I imagined being. More present, more vulnerable, I suppose." "Vulnerability isn't weakness, Edward, it's courage." He nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her words. In recent months he had learned that showing emotions to Lucas, talking openly about their shared loss, didn't diminish his authority as a father. On the contrary, it strengthened the bond between them. In the garden, Lucas and Patricia were so absorbed in their activity that they didn't immediately notice the adult's approach. The scene was one of serene domesticity, the boy, with hands dirty with soil, closely following Patricia's instructions on how to accommodate the fragile seedlings. "Hello," called Edward softly. Lucas turned, smiling upon seeing his father, but his expression became cautious upon noticing Fiona. The last time he had seen her was on the fateful day of the candidates. "Lucas, do you remember Fiona?" asked Edward. The boy nodded, still hesitant. "She brought those chocolate cookies last time," he replied, revealing a detail that Edward didn't even remember. Fiona smiled, crouching to be at his level, but maintaining a respectful distance. "You have a good memory. This time I didn't bring cookies, but perhaps we could make some together if your father allows." Lucas looked at Patricia as if seeking her approval. She nodded slightly, a subtle gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Edward. "Okay," the boy agreed, turning back to his seedlings. "But now I need to finish planting my sunflowers. The teacher said they'll grow to the sky if I take good care of them." "Without a doubt they will," affirmed Fiona, observing his work with genuine interest. "You chose an excellent spot with plenty of sun." The comment seemed to please Lucas, who began to explain, with the enthusiasm characteristic of children, the entire school project about the life cycle of plants. Edward took the opportunity to formally introduce the two women. "Patricia, this is Fiona Taylor. Fiona, Patricia Souza, Lucas's tutor." The two exchanged cordial greetings, studying each other with that subtle assessment that intelligent women often carry out. "Lucas talks a lot about you," commented Fiona to Patricia. "It seems you've been doing amazing work with him." "He's an extraordinary boy," Patricia replied simply. "Easy to love." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Edward, observing the interaction, felt a wave of gratitude for the woman who had essentially saved his son, and by extension himself, from a path of isolation and bitterness. Lunch proceeded in a pleasant atmosphere on the terrace, overlooking the garden. Lucas, initially reserved with Fiona, gradually relaxed upon realizing that, unlike the other women who had visited the house months before, she didn't try to impress him or force a connection. On the contrary, she treated him with the same respect she showed to adults, attentively listening to his opinions on books, games, and his recent scientific discoveries. Patricia, invited to join them at Lucas's insistence, remained discreetly in the conversation, offering occasional comments but mainly observing the dynamics among the others. Edward noticed how her eyes, perceptive and attentive, followed each interaction, especially those of Lucas with Fiona. After dessert, a lemon pie that was Susan's specialty, the cook, Lucas asked permission to show Fiona his mineral collection. "Can I take her to see my room, Dad?" "Of course, if Fiona wants to go." "It would be an honor," she replied, standing to follow the enthusiastic boy. When the two left, a momentary silence settled between Edward and Patricia, not exactly uncomfortable, but laden with unspoken things. "She seems different from the others," Patricia finally commented, surprising Edward with the observation. "She is perceptive," he replied, smiling slightly. Lucas liked her from the first meeting, even on that disastrous day. "Children have an impressive radar for authenticity," said Patricia, absently playing with her napkin. "Fiona isn't trying to buy his affection with grandiose promises or expensive gifts. She's simply present." Edward studied Patricia with a new interest. In the 3 months since her return, they had developed a cordial relationship based on Lucas's well-being but rarely talked about personal matters. "Do you think I'm making the same mistake as before?" he asked, implicitly referring to the disastrous idea of the candidates. Patricia considered the question seriously before responding. "No. This time it seems different. You're not looking for a substitute for Emily or a quick solution to the emptiness of the house. You seem to be getting to know Fiona as a person, not as a potential mother for Lucas." The precision of the observation surprised him again. "Can you always read situations with such clarity?" A soft smile touched her lips. "Years teaching young children. You learn to observe the unspoken, the patterns, the subtle dynamics." "Lucas is lucky to have you in his life," said Edward, with a sincerity that surprised them both. "The luck is mine," she replied. "And if I may make an observation, Lucas is also lucky to have a father who was able to reconsider his decisions and priorities for his sake. Many men in your position would never admit a mistake." The unexpected compliment warmed Edward inside. Before he could respond, Lucas and Fiona returned, the boy animatedly explaining the properties of a rose quartz that was the highlight of his collection. "Patricia, can I show Fiona the book we're reading?" asked Lucas. "Of course, it's on your room's bookshelf." "Come with me," the boy insisted, extending his hand to Patricia. She looked at Edward, who nodded slightly. "We're reading The Little Prince," she explained to Fiona as she stood up. Lucas has many philosophical questions about the story. When they were alone, Edward and Fiona walked to the edge of the terrace, observing the well-tended gardens that extended to the property's walls. "Your house seems like a completely different place now," she commented. "It has life." "Thanks to you, in large part," replied Edward. "It was your advice that made me realize how much Lucas was suffering." Fiona smiled, lightly touching his arm in a gesture of appreciation. "I only stated the obvious. You did the hard part, reconsidering your convictions, prioritizing Lucas's emotional needs above social conventions." "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "I had to confront many of my prejudices and insecurities. The result seems worth it. Lucas is visibly flourishing, and you too, if I may make the observation." Edward laughed softly. "Am I?" Margaret mentioned that I seem less tense. "More than that, you seem more present, more connected, less the impeccable businessman and more simply Edward." The observation touched him deeply. It was true. In recent months, he had begun to reevaluate not just his relationship with Lucas, but his entire way of being in the world. The long hours at the office had decreased. He had begun to delegate more, to trust his team, to allow himself time to simply be with his son, without agendas or objectives. "I've learned a lot from Lucas and from Patricia," he admitted, "about what really matters." Fiona looked in the direction of the house, where they could see Lucas and Patricia through the bedroom window, apparently involved in reading the book. "She's a remarkable woman," she observed. "The bond between them is evident." "Sometimes I wonder if I should feel threatened by it," confessed Edward, surprised by his own frankness. "In the beginning I certainly did, as if she were taking my place in his life. And now? Now I understand that it's not a competition. Patricia isn't replacing anyone, neither me nor Emily. She created her own space in Lucas's life, a space that, apparently, he desperately needed." Fiona nodded, understanding. "Children have an incredible capacity to love many people in different ways. It's not a limited resource that needs to be disputed." "Do you have children?" asked Edward, realizing that despite months of conversations, they had never discussed this aspect of her life. "Not biologically," replied Fiona, a touch of melancholy in her voice. "But I'm godmother to 3 nephews whom I practically raised when my sister fell ill. They're in college now, but they still call me every week." "Did you never want to have your own children?" "I did, yes. But life doesn't always follow our plans, does it? My ex-husband couldn't have children, and when we separated, I was already close to 40. I decided that if it happened, great. If not, I would be fine too." The serenity with which she spoke of disappointments and adaptations touched Edward. There was a wisdom there, an acceptance of life as it is, not as we would like it to be, something he himself still struggled to achieve. The afternoon progressed in easy conversations and occasional laughter. Lucas, initially cautious with Fiona, gradually relaxed, even inviting her to see the hummingbird nests he had discovered in a tree near the wall. When it finally came time for Fiona to leave, Lucas surprised everyone by offering her one of his collection stones, a small polished red jasper. "For you to remember today," he said with the adorable seriousness of children. "I'll keep it with great affection," she replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. Edward accompanied her to the car, a feeling of contentment permeating his entire being. "Thank you for coming," he said, lightly holding her hand. "It was a special afternoon." "For me too," replied Fiona, her eyes meeting his with quiet sincerity. "I hope we can repeat it." "I would like that very much," said Edward, leaning in to kiss her cheek in farewell. Back at the house, he found Lucas and Patricia in the living room, organizing the photographs that had been recently rescued from boxes and drawers. The boy had decided to create a new family album, with images not only from the past but also from the present. "Dad, come help us," called Lucas enthusiastically. "We're separating the photos by year." Edward joined them, on the carpet, examining images that evoked memories both sweet and bittersweet. One in particular caught his attention: Emily pregnant, sitting on the garden swing, laughing at something Edward had said. "That's from the day Mum felt the first kick," explained Lucas, surprising Edward with the precision of the memory. It couldn't be his own, certainly, but something Emily must have shared with him. "That's true," confirmed Edward, smiling at the memory. "She was so excited she wanted to wake all the neighbors to tell them." Lucas laughed, a clear and carefree sound that months before had seemed to have disappeared forever. Patricia observed the interaction with a discreet smile, silently organizing the photographs in chronological piles. "Patricia, where do you think we should put this?" asked Edward, showing her a recent photograph of Lucas in the garden, taken a few weeks after her return to the house. She seemed surprised at being included in the family decision. "Perhaps in the New Beginnings section," she suggested, indicating one of the categories Lucas had created. "Perfect," agreed Edward, handing the photo to Lucas to place it in the designated spot. As they worked together on the project, Edward was struck by a clear and unexpected realization. This was his family now. Not the conventional family he had imagined creating, not the perfect portrait he had tried to force with the candidates, but something unique, built with pieces of the past and possibilities of the present. Imperfect, perhaps. Unconventional, certainly, but real, alive, and above all based on genuine connections. Lucas, between the two adults, chatted animatedly about his ideas for the album, occasionally asking opinions from both his father and Patricia, treating them as equals in importance in his life. There was no longer the tension of the first days after her return, when Edward still struggled against feelings of jealousy and inadequacy. Now there was only gratitude, for the son who was finding his way back to joy, for Patricia who had the courage to challenge conventions to be present when Lucas needed her most, and for Emily, whose memory, far from being a painful ghost, had become a comforting presence that guided all of them. Later that night, after Lucas fell asleep, Edward found Patricia on the veranda, observing the stars with a cup of tea in her hands. "May I join you?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, indicating the chair beside her. They remained in comfortable silence for a few minutes, contemplating the night sky above the illuminated gardens. "Lucas liked Fiona," Patricia finally commented. "Yes, I noticed. It's a good sign, I suppose." Patricia turned to face him directly. "Edward," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I want you to know that I will always respect your space as Lucas's father. If you and Fiona decide to build something together, I will fully support it." Her frankness surprised him once again. "Thank you, Patricia, that means a lot, but we're just beginning to get to know each other, without pressures or expectations." She nodded, approving. "That's the right path. Lucas needs time and space to adjust to changes." "And you?" asked Edward, curious. "Is there someone special in your life?" Patricia smiled, slightly embarrassed by the personal question. "Not at the moment. My life in recent years has been focused on work and studies. I'm doing a postgraduate degree in psychopedagogy on weekends." "I didn't know that. It's impressive." "Thank you. It's challenging but rewarding." Edward realized, not for the first time, how little he knew about the woman who had become so important in his son's life. "I would like to know more about..." You, Patricia, about your dreams, your plans. She seemed genuinely surprised by the interest. Why? Because you're part of Lucas's life now, and by extension of mine. Not just as an employee, but as family, I suppose. The word came out naturally, surprising them both. Patricia lowered her gaze to her cup, visibly moved. That means a lot to me, she said softly. Lucas brought light back to my life at a very difficult time. Losing my job as a teacher, having to start over at 35, it wasn't easy. And then you found a lonely boy who desperately needed someone who really saw him. I think we found each other at the right time, she corrected with a gentle smile. Edward nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. The silence that followed was comfortable, laden not with tension, but with mutual understanding. The next morning, Sunday, Edward woke to the sound of laughter coming from the garden. Looking out the window, he saw Lucas and Patricia watering the newly planted sunflowers. The boy was saying something that made Patricia laugh, a melodious sound that Edward realized he had never really noticed before. He dressed quickly and went down to join them, bringing with him the camera he rarely used. Upon seeing him approach, Lucas waved enthusiastically. "Dad, come see, the sunflowers are already starting to sprout." Edward knelt beside his son, observing the tiny green dots emerging from the dark soil. "Impressive," he commented genuinely. "They grow fast. Patricia said in a few weeks they'll be my height and in 2 months taller than you. Is that so? Well, we'll have to document this growth," replied Edward, raising the camera. "How about a photo of the gardeners with their creation?" Lucas immediately pulled Patricia close, positioning himself next to the flower bed. She smiled, naturally comfortable beside the boy who'd become so important in her life. "You too, Dad," insisted Lucas. "Come for the photo." Edward hesitated, looking at the camera in his hands. "Who's going to take it?" "I can help," offered Margaret, who was approaching with a tray of fresh juices. Edward handed her the camera and joined Lucas and Patricia by the sunflower bed. The three smiled for the lens, the morning sun creating a golden halo around them. A new family, not conventional, built not by blood ties or social conventions, but by conscious choices and genuine affection. As Margaret captured the moment, Edward knew with absolute certainty that Emily would approve. Not because Patricia or Fiona could replace her, no one ever could, but because the most important thing for her had always been Lucas's happiness. And there, on that Sunday morning, with the sunflowers sprouting from the earth like promises of better days, Lucas had finally returned to being happy. It wasn't the ending Edward had imagined for his story. It was something more complex, richer, woven with threads of loss and discovery, pain and healing, challenged conventions and new possibilities embraced. It was imperfect and still under construction, like life itself. But, as he watched Lucas run through the garden, calling him to see a newly discovered bird's nest, Edward knew he wouldn't trade this imperfect reality for any artificially constructed fairy tale. This was his family now. This was his home. Not just the mansion with its high walls and security systems, but the emotional space they had created together. A refuge where pain could be expressed, where memories could be honored, and where new connections could flourish, alongside the old ones, not replacing them, but enriching the fabric of their shared lives. And as he walked through the garden, following his son's enthusiastic steps, with Patricia right behind and Emily's memory gently hovering over all of them, Edward finally understood what Lucas had instinctively grasped months before, that the heart, unlike physical spaces,